Rutger, thank you for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
Ja, hallo und herzlich willkommen zu eurem Dissens-Podcast. Das war Rutger Bregman, unser Gast für diese Woche. Rutger ist einer der wichtigsten Denker in Europa. Ein paar von euch kennen ihn sicherlich oder haben vielleicht schon mal seinen Namen gehört. Sein Buch Utopien für Realisten wurde in zahlreiche Sprachen übersetzt. Jetzt hat der Niederländer ein neues Buch vorgelegt, Im Grunde gut heißt es. Darin zeigt Rutger, dass wir uns als Menschen mehr durch Freundlichkeit und Gemeinsinn auszeichnen als durch Hass und Egoismus. Wir sprechen über das Wesen des Menschen und was daraus folgt für unsere Welt nach der Corona-Krise. Das Interview, ihr habt's mitbekommen, ist auf Englisch. Für alle, die da keine Lust drauf haben, gibt's eine deutsche Version in schriftlicher Form auf dissenspodcast.de. Der Link natürlich auch in den Shownotes. So, jetzt geht's aber los. Mein Name ist Lukas Undreka. Viel Spaß mit Dissens. Rutger, you wrote a new book. It's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. The main claim of your book is that it is empathy, compassion, and kindness that make us human beings. Mm-hmm. The Corona-Krise sometimes seems to bring out a darker and more selfish side in us. What do you make of that?
Well, I mean, if you follow the news and look on social media, there are certain examples of, people behaving in a selfish way, hoarding stuff in the supermarkets or fighting over toilet paper or whatever. But I think that if you zoom out a little bit, then you see that actually the vast majority of the behavior right now is pro-social in nature. It's people actually helping each other. You see so many groups originating on social media, WhatsApp groups and Facebook groups, people saying we got to help each other. I think that for every hoarder, for every egoist, there are 1,000 civilians who are willing to do their best to stop the virus from spreading. And for every panic buyer, there are 1,000 nurses, working their ass off. So I think that's important to do right now, is to zoom out and look what most people are actually doing.
Why do you think it is that it's difficult for us as humans to zoom out and see the bigger picture? That seems to be that most people in a crisis situation like the corona pandemic behave in a kind and compassionate way, and that selfish behavior is the exception.
Well, I think the real question would be, why is it so difficult for journalists? Because to be honest, I think that most people actually would share my opinion, been talking about it with my neighbors, people on social media, many of my readers. Most people say, look, Rutger, basically what you describe in your book, I see it happening right now. Mm-hmm. We have an extraordinary amount of evidence from sociology about, what happens after natural disasters, for example, after tsunamis or earthquakes. And, more than 500 case studies since the 1960s show that every single time you get an explosion of altruism and cooperation, rich, poor, young, old, left-wing, right-wing, everyone helping each other. It's just that the media and the news is often full of different kind of stories, rumors about looting and violence and plundering and all kinds of nasty stuff. It's just that later scientists discover that something different has happened. But during this crisis, I get the feeling that actually the vast majority of people would agree that most behavior right now is cooperative in nature. It's just that journalists keep going on about these panic buyers and hoarders, even though, I don't know.
Yeah, I guess I had to ask you, obviously, but journalists would say that good news are no news at all.
Exactly. I think the news is mostly about stuff that goes wrong, right? Corruption, crises, terrorism, violence. So if you watch the news all day, at the end of the day, you know exactly how the world doesn't work, because you've only been hearing about these exceptions, right? You have a completely upside down worldview and twisted view of human nature. There's even a term for this in psychology, right? They call it mean world syndrome. It's something you get by watching too much of the news.
Yeah. Before turning to your book, Rutger, I would like to ask you, what do you think will the corona pandemic do to our societies? How will it change our societies? I think it's like a real test right now for us, and also a turning point when it comes to politics and also economics. So what do you make of this turning point, and do you see some hope for real and good change in that?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I have to emphasize is something that most people already feel in their bones right now, which is that we are living, you know, through world history in the making right now.
Yeah.
This is bigger than the financial crash of 2008. It may even be bigger than, 9/11 in the long run. It really seems to be a shifting point. And historians have long known that crises and shifting points, can change everything for societies. The thing is, though, that I do not predict the future. I think that's nonsense. The only thing we can do is sort of to sketch scenarios and possibilities, right? And right now, I see two things happening at the same time.
Okay.
So in the first place, we know that crises can be used by authoritarian rulers to expand their power. This is the oldest trick in the book. Hitler used it with the burning of the Reichstag. Now we see it being done by Orban in Hungary, who's got this emergency decree and is now ruling basically by decree. We can also see, an assault on our privacy and measures that are, implemented on a temporary basis now may actually become, held up and be there for the long term.
Yeah, here in Germany, the government is probably going to start an app to track the spread of coronavirus. There seem to be ways to design this app in a way that respects privacy, and obviously this app shouldn't be mandatory, I think. But Rutger, let's talk about the positive part of coronavirus. How could Corona be a window of opportunity for progressive politics in the future?
I think that this crisis could also move politics in a very different direction, because now people are realizing that individualism is not going to save us. Competition is not going to save us. Businesses are not going to save us, right? We need a very different kind of values to get through this crisis, right? We need cooperation. We need solidarity. We need a stronger state. We need businesses to pay their taxes, and actually businesses are now again begging for bailout with government. So it also could move politics in a very different direction. Just also look at, the whole discussion around the value of work and different kind of jobs.
Yeah.
Around the world, there are now lists being drawn up with the so-called vital professions. And you know what? It turns out it's not the bankers. It's not the hedge fund managers. It's not the marketeers.
It's the doctors, the nurses.
And the garbage collectors. And who knew? Who knew, right? So this could have long-term implications, because for years and years, you can say, remember the Corona-Krise, right? And remember during the height of the epidemic, who did we rely on? Not the CEOs and the bankers. No, but on the nurses and the cleaners, right? So this could influence politics for a generation if we'll make use of it. So yeah, I can only sketch the scenarios and the possibilities and say that this will be a shifting point. We just don't know in which direction it's going to go yet.
And do you think the left or the progressives in this world are prepared? Because there's also this other side, right? That authoritarian nationalism could rise up.
Exactly. I don't know yet, but I am hopeful. I am hopeful that we've done better work than we did before the financial crash of 2008. The financial crash of 2008 also could have been a wake-up call, right? Or a moment that could have been used by progressives in Europe and the US. But what you actually saw is that social democracy was pretty much destroyed in Europe. It was losing everywhere. And it seemed that, people had gone into a coma, sort of kind of a dreamless sleep, where there was hardly any utopian thinking. I think the biggest problem back then with the left was that it only knew what it was against, right? It was against austerity, against the establishment, against homophobia, against racism. It's a phenomenon that I call underdog socialism or loser socialism. All this infighting, right? Very bad at building coalitions, or very bad at actually thinking about power and how you can change institutions. Mostly interested in sort of being right or something like that, or rather be right and lose than be a little bit wrong and win, right? But my hope is that things have changed here and that we are now better prepared. Just look at what's been happening in the US, for example. The whole Overton window, the whole window of political possibility has shifted a huge amount in the past 5-6 years. If you look at even a guy like Joe Biden right now, and I'm not a huge fan, but Joe Biden's climate plan is more radical than Bernie Sanders' climate plan of 2016, right? Okay. If you look at the tax plan of Pete Buttigieg, right, it's like 3 or 4 times as radical as the tax plan of Hillary Clinton in 2016.
Still, I think Bernie would have made a wonderful president. But
Yeah, but he has won the battle of ideas. I guess that's my point.
Yeah.
Even if he won't be president, in a way, he has already won.
Yeah, I think it could go both ways. And as progressive and leftists, we have to get involved, obviously.
Exactly.
But Rutger, let's talk about your book, which is kind of the book of the hour, because you ask exactly the question, which view of us as humans should shape politics after the Corona-Krise or during the Corona-Krise. In English, it's called Humankind, A Hopeful History. The original Dutch title is De meeste mensen deugen.
Yeah.
Did I pronounce that right?
Exactly, yeah.
Most people are good, would be the translation in English.
Yeah.
And in German, it's called Im Grunde gut, eine neue Geschichte der Menschheit. This book is basically a big argument. We hinged up on this topic about what's the nature of the human species, whether it's good or evil. And you argue that as humans, we are good. What evidence is it that you can put forward that we are not selfish and the strongest rules over the others, but friendly and compassionate?
Yeah. Well, what we have seen in the past 15 to 20 years is that scientists from very diverse disciplines, right? So anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, and psychologists, that they've all moved to a much more hopeful view of humanity.
Okay.
And they often even don't know it from each other, right? Because they're all specialized in their own fields. I had one conversation with a prominent psychologist who did research on the so-called bystander effect, you know, how people behave during emergency. Say someone is drowning or you know, someone's being attacked in the street, and then how do people behave? And this psychologist had shown that actually in 90% of all cases, people help each other, you know, based on CCTV footage, you know, like real incidents in the real world. So I was talking to this psychologist and I told her, you know, about similar things happening in biology, you know, where also biologists have moved to a more hopeful view of human nature. They talk about survival of the friendliest these days, and they show that actually for millennia, it was the friendliest among us who had the most kids and so had the biggest chance of passing on their genes to the next generation.
Okay.
And then that psychologist said to me, oh my God, so it's happening there as well. So this is really what I try to do in the book. I'm just connecting the dots. I'm zooming out and I'm showing that something bigger is going on in science right now.
Yeah, I mean, you're sketching out evolutionary biologists, psychologists, but also neuroscientists. What I was amazed with, that you kind of destroyed some experiments that shaped my opinion about how human nature is. I mean, I learned in school about experiments like the Stanford prison experiment and the Milgram-Schuck experiment.
Yeah, me too.
Which basically, even until today, even though there is evidence to the contrary, even until today, they shape our view about how people behave in extraordinary circumstances and how they do evil things. So what do you make of these two experiments? And maybe explain a bit how you stumbled upon evidence that contradicts those learnings from these experiments.
So let's start with the Stanford prison experiment, right? This is one of the most famous experiments that has been done in psychology in the 20th century. And up until this day, it's still in almost every textbook around the globe, you know, for psychology students. So it's really, really famous. It happened at the beginning of the 70s. The researcher here was Philip Zimbardo, an American professor. And what he did is he had 24 students that he divided up in so-called guards and prisoners. And he put them in a fake prison in the basement of Stanford University. And he basically said, you know, just do what you want as the guards. Just implement your own regime. But then after 6 days, the experiment had to be canceled because, you know, all kinds of horrible stuff was going on. You know, the guards behaved in terribly sadistic ways. And so the message of the experiment was, look, this is what's below the surface, you know, in human nature. Civilization is only a thin veneer. And if you put people just in a little bit of a different context, if you give them the freedom to abuse other people, they will do so. These students were pacifist hippies, but still deep down, you know, they were evil sadists, right? And even Philip Zimbardo himself was swept up in the experiment, as this story that he later told. So this is an incredibly famous experiment, and it's always being used to explain all kinds of atrocities in history, right? I think it became also very famous, obviously, because it was used as an explanation for the horrors of the Second World War and the Holocaust, with the message that, you know, there's a Nazi in each of us. If you get rid of that thin layer of civilization, then, you know, people reveal their true selves and we're all selfish and we're all beasts. Now, I used to believe this for quite a while as well. I mean, I have written about this in earlier articles and in books. It was only while researching this book that I basically discovered that it was a hoax.
Okay.
It's a total hoax. The whole experiment it's what Donald Trump would call fake. Fake science.
But being right.
So we know now, based on archival material, is that actually Zimbardo specifically instructed his students to be as sadistic as possible.
Okay.
Then many of those students said, I don't want to do that. You know, if it were up to me, we would just drink tea and have a nice time together. But then Zimbardo said, no, you got to do this. You have to do this because I need these results, right? I want to prove that prisons are horrible environments. So then we can go to the press and basically help reform the prison system in the United States. And that's what you want, right? You're progressive hippies. Come on, help me with this. And so they went along. And then the story Zimbardo later told was just basically a lie. There's a book published in French just last year by a French sociologist, Thibault Le Texier. And the title of that book is The History of a Lie. And so I think that is really the right terminology here with the Stanford prison experiment, because it's just, it was a theater, you know? It's and it's just extraordinary to think that this fake scientific experiment is still in the textbooks of millions of psychology students around the globe.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that later the BBC, the English broadcasting channel, repeated the experiment for early reality TV, and it was a big disaster, at least for the TV show makers, right?
You know, it was basically the same setup. Again, around 24 people put in a prison, and this was, you know, the early days of reality TV. So the BBC hoped to get some really exciting footage, right? Of, you know, repeating the Stanford prison experiment, because that would be great for ratings. But then they worked with two British psychologists who said, yes, we'll work with you, but on the condition that we will not interfere. So we will not give instruction to the prisoners. And the BBC said, yes, they agreed. And that was a terrible decision for them, because it turned out that, you know, it became the most boring reality TV ever. Nothing happened, you know. It's just the prisoners and the guards. They became friends. At the end of the couple of days, they had set up a pacifistic commune and they were just, you know, playing cards and drinking tea together in the lounge area. It's horrible. I had to watch all these episodes, 4 episodes of an hour long. I'll never get those hours back because it was so boring.
Yeah.
I mean, makers of reality TV have known this for a long time, that if you put people on an island, if you put them in a villa somewhere far away, and you just give them the freedom to do whatever they want, nothing happens. You know, they just become friends. It's terrible for ratings. It's really terrible. So what you got to do is you got to lie to them. You got to manipulate them. You got to deceive them. And then maybe something small happens that you can take out of context, and then blah, blah, blah. And then, I mean, it's a hard job, you know, to make good reality television. Should be respectful of these people because it's fun. It's really hard. The general inclination of people in normal circumstances is just to connect and to make friends.
Yeah, but even in the light of these fake experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, for example, or reality TV, we know it's fake, obviously. But even in the light of that, you have to ask, why do people in history do bad things to other people, right? And there's a lot of examples of that. And you mentioned one yourself, the Holocaust. And the first thing that shot to my mind when I read like the first pages of your book was like, what about Auschwitz? And you yourself, you mentioned that in your book. So, Rutger, what about Auschwitz? How do you explain that?
Well, this is obviously one of the ironies of my book, right? If you want to write a book about the kindness and goodness in human nature, then you have to go on for hundreds of pages about all the horrors in history. You know, the ethnic cleansing, the wars, the Holocaust. And it's true, right? We are not only the friendliest species in the animal kingdom, we're probably also the cruelest species. Yeah. I mean, I've never heard of a penguin who said, you know, let's lock up another group of penguins and exterminate them, right? These are singularly human crimes. And the question only becomes bigger once you sort of discard this veneer theory, right? If you do not believe that civilization is a thin veneer, and if you do not believe that people are fundamentally deep down selfish and aggressive, then the question only becomes bigger. How could it be that people who have evolved to be friendly, to cooperate, to work together, and if it is true that that is our true superpower as a species, right? That we can work together in such a big scale, then why do we do these horrible things? I cannot pretend, obviously, to give a short answer to that question. I mean, I go on for hundreds of pages about it, and I still think it's too short. I mean, you can write libraries full of books. What I can do is sort of give the beginning of an answer. So what biologists have come up with recently is sort of this new theory of the evolution of humankind, right? And they call it survival of the friendliest. As I said, for millennia, I was actually the friendliest among us, who had the most kids and had the biggest chance of passing on their genes. But there is a dark side to friendliness, right? Friendliness can also be conformity. And people who, want to be liked find it hard to go against their own group. And if you really care about your own group, you may start disliking the other group, the out group, right? So what psychologists and biologists now suspect is there's a deep connection here between our empathy and our xenophobia, right? So we feel empathy for our own group and we start disliking the other group. We have a button for tribalism in our brain. And I think this plays an extraordinary important role in the big disasters and atrocities in human history, is that as you start to care more about your own group, you find it hard to go against your own group and to go against your own leaders. So often in history, you see that friendliness can stand in the way of justice and of the truth. So that is, I guess, one of the big paradoxes of my book, is that I argue that human beings have evolved to be friendly, and sometimes that's exactly the problem.
Ja, ich möchte die kurze Pause für einen klitzekleinen Werbeblock nutzen, denn den Dissens-Podcast für euch zu recherchieren und zu produzieren, das kostet jede Menge Zeit und damit auch Geld. Wenn du es dir also leisten kannst, dann mach doch mit bei Dissens und werde jetzt Fördermitglied. Das geht schon ab 2 € im Monat. Dissens hat mehr als 340 Freunde, die dem Podcast monatlich Geld geben und dadurch ermöglichen, dass wir gute Ideen für alle da draußen senden können. Aber damit Dissens eine Perspektive hat, müssen wir in diesem Jahr auf mindestens 500 Fördermitglieder kommen. Als Fördermitglied nimmst du unter anderem automatisch an Verlosungen teil. Auch zu dieser Folge gibt es ein Buch zu gewinnen, und zwar im Grunde gut von Rutger Bregman. Alle Infos zum Buch und dazu, wie ihr bei Dissens mitmachen könnt, gibt's in den Shownotes und auf dissenspodcast.de. Ihr hört den Dissens-Podcast. Zu Gast ist der Historiker und Philosoph Rutger Bregman. Rutger, if we take your proposition for granted that it is not civilization that is saving us from becoming animals, but that humans are fundamentally kind and good, what follows from that view for our view of civilization and capitalist progress?
Yeah, of course. Well, a couple of things. In the first place, I wouldn't say that human beings are naturally, fundamentally, or intrinsically good. In fact, in the first chapter, I point out, that we have a good side and obviously a not so good side, right? What I am saying is that what you assume in other people is often what you get out of them. So if you assume that most people are selfish, are aggressive, and you name it, then you'll start designing your society around that idea. You start designing your institutions, your schools, your democracies, the workplace around the idea that people are selfish, and you will create the kind of people that your theory presupposes. So this is interesting about our theories of human nature. It's not just strictly about what is true or what is false. It's also about what ideas can become self-fulfilling prophecies. I think that's important to keep in mind. Then the other question about, the role of civilization in human history. Well, the standard story that we've always been told was that this march of progress story, that at least they taught me in school, right? That a long time ago, when we were hunter-gatherers, we were in this war of all against all. We were very violent, and we were these brutish cavemen, right? Or as Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, called us, we lived existences that were nasty, brutish, and short. But then came civilization. Then we invented agriculture. We started building villages and cities, and we invented money and writing and the wheel. And every milestone of civilization made things a little bit better for us. And so our task is just to strengthen that civilization, to hold on to it as best as we can. Because if the veneer of civilization goes away, then we'll go back to our, dark, evil selves once again. This is the story that, kids around the globe are still being taught, I think.
Yeah.
But if you look at the latest evidence from anthropology and archaeology, you find a completely different picture. So we know that for hundreds of thousands of years, we lived as nomadic hunter-gatherers, right? So 95% of our existence, we were nomadic hunter-gatherers. How do nomadic hunter-gatherers live? Well, we can study them, the tribes who still live around the globe, right? Or lived so in the 19th or the 20th century and were studied by anthropologists. And what you find is a quite consistent picture of tribes that are quite egalitarian. There's equality between the sexes and there's relatively little hierarchy. You find people who are pretty healthy. So they have a nice and varied diet. They have a bit of fruit, a bit of vegetables, a bit of meat. They have enough exercise. They don't have all these infection diseases that we have today. And they have a relatively relaxed lifestyle as well. So their work week is, 20, 30 hours at max. Now, if you compare that lifestyle of the nomadic hunter-gatherer to the people who were so-called civilized, right? The urbanites and the farmers, it's a huge difference. So civilization, the most part of the history of civilization was a huge disaster. What you see once we settled down and started domesticating species and doing agriculture is that people's health deteriorated. You see this when you study skeletons from nomadic hunter-gatherers and compare it to farmers, for example. You see that they're much shorter and thinner bones and bad teeth and you name it. They didn't have a very varied diet anymore, which is grains all day. They had to work very hard on the land, no pain, no grain. It was just a much worse lifestyle. But what you also see is that actually the history of war starts with the history of civilization. So for wars, there's no archaeological or almost no archaeological evidence for war, group violence among nomadic hunter-gatherers. But then once we settle down, you suddenly find all this archaeological evidence, right? Cave paintings, skeletons with damaged bones, etc., etc. So the picture here really changes, is that actually the people who were living nasty, brutish, and short lives, these were the civilized people, while the nomadic hunter-gatherers had much better lives.
Yeah.
Now, why have we forgotten this? I think an important reason is that just very recently, in the past 50 to 100 years, we've seen so much progress, right? We are richer, we are healthier, we are wealthier right now than ever before in world history, is that we have forgotten that actually the vast majority of the history of civilization was a huge disaster. And obviously the question is, how sustainable is this, right? Because now we are relatively rich and healthy, etc. But we also have the environmental crisis, the ecological crisis, species dying out on a crazy scale. So we don't know if we can still live like this a century or 2 centuries or 3 centuries from now. That's the big gamble we're taking.
Yeah.
So if you zoom out, a very different picture emerges of the history of our species.
Yeah.
What you see is that actually for hundreds of thousands of years, we had a relatively good lifestyle. I wouldn't say that we were angels, right? There was aggression, there was jealousies, but on average, it was a much better lifestyle than the lifestyle that came after that of farmers and urbanites. It's just that recently we had this, after the Industrial Revolution, we had this explosion, obviously, of economic growth, etc. But then the question is how sustainable that is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question also of the narrative of progress and civilization and how far we can change this narrative or alter it to a narrative that tackles climate crisis, for example.
Oh, and think about the infection diseases, right? Corona is a modern civilized disease, right? It is. You get all these infection diseases, measles, polio, malaria. You get it because we live too close to animals, right? Nomadic hunter-gatherers hardly had any infection diseases. It's really a product of civilization.
Yeah.
And this is also, we know that, plagues have really been a consistent feature of the last 10,000 years. Again and again, you see huge amount of people dying off and dying off and dying off again and again and again. So Corona is a typically consequence of a so-called civilized lifestyle.
Yeah, I totally see that, and I agree. And you also could mention like how the narrative of civilization in the past, and even nowadays, is used to colonize parts of the world and to extract wealth, for example, in the Amazonas from indigenous communities. So this is a whole story that we have to be careful about. But still, I wonder if you kind of romanticize in a way or glorify the times of hunters and gatherers, because you can't seriously say, okay, we should abandon civilization and go back to like a hunter's gatherer lifestyle.
Yeah, of course. It's impossible. We couldn't do it.
So what would be like policy proposals that you make out of your view of humans as being good people mostly?
Well, I think we need to understand where we come from, right? I think we need to understand our history so that we can actually shape our future in the right way as well. What we have done in the past couple of decades, especially in the Western world, is that we have designed so many of our institutions around the idea that people are selfish, right? This happened in the era that now seems to be coming to an end, and that many people would call the Neoliberal Era, right? So it started basically in the 1950s with intellectuals like Friedrich von Hayek and Milton Friedman, who back then were the real outcasts, but knew they had to develop their new ideas, right? So back then in the 50s, everyone was a socialist. After the Second World War, it was clear that there was an important role for the state. Yeah, so it was really the era of the big government. But then these people were already developing their ideas and building a network of think tanks and in other institutions. And I think the central idea of neoliberalism was and is that most people are selfish, right? And that you have to structure your markets and your schools and your democracies and everything around that idea. And so we did. So when the crisis came in the 1970s, the oil crises and stagflation, these ideas that had been developed for years were picked up by politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. And so in the 30 years after that, we started designing all our societies around it. And even social democracy was infected by it, by what they called the third way, of Tony Blair. Tony Blair. Did I say phony Blair? I mean, Tony Blair.
Telling.
Yeah. And this obviously resulted in the financial crash and increasing inequality, and I think more anxiety and an epidemic of loneliness as well. Maybe it's too early to say, but I think you could argue that now this era is coming to an end, and that we realize that we actually need a new view of human nature, a new sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. And I would like to call this sort of the Neo-Realist Era, where we move to a more optimistic, a more hopeful view of human beings, and say that actually people are, on average, pretty decent, and that we can design our institutions around that idea, right? This movement already started, I think, 25 years ago. I mean, many of the scientists that I interviewed for this book, were doing their pioneering work 2 decades ago. But now it has grown into something much bigger. And in the second half of my book, I also talk about, entrepreneurs or school leaders or, even prisons that are experimenting with, designing your institutions in a different way. That's really the most important thing. It's not just about self-help, how you live your own life, but it's really about institutional change because different institutions produce different people.
Yeah, I quite like that perspective. But on different occasions, you talked about things like universal basic income, open borders, and a 50-hour work week. So are those like concrete proposals that fit your worldview in a way, or that could lead to people seeing themselves as, or seeing others as better people?
Well, my previous book, Utopia for Realists, was basically about the process how utopian ideas can become reality. So as I mentioned, these neoliberal ideas in the 1950s, they were completely utopian. They were not being taken seriously. They were on the fringes of public debate. But then they started moving towards the center and they became reality, right? So there's this famous Milton Friedman quote where he said that basically the task of intellectuals is to develop new ideas and to prepare for the next crisis. Because when that crisis comes, everything depends on the ideas that are lying around, right? So I guess that's also the fundamental question of this Corona crisis is, what ideas are lying around? And have we done our homework, right? That will be the real test.
Rutger, I wonder how the book maybe transformed yourself while writing it. So maybe tell us about this journey of how that also informed your own view and changed your own behavior maybe also.
Yeah. I used to be a much more cynical guy. I'd studied history, obviously, and maybe it's an effect of studying history because history is a little bit like the news, right? It's mostly about wars. And then if there's not a war, we call it the interbellum, right? The in-between wars. And I used to believe all these stories, from the Stanford prison experiment to the Milgram experiment where, normal, average, healthy people are willing to give fatal electric shocks to random strangers. I mean, I used to believe all these things. But then, after I had written my previous book, Utopia for Realists, and one of the main ideas in Utopia for Realists was the idea of a basic income, right? Giving everyone a monthly grant that is enough to pay for your basic needs. I had gone over all the scientific evidence, basically, that shows that this actually works, right? What you get is an explosion of cooperation and people starting new companies and moving to different jobs, and kids do much better in school. So I collected a lot of empirical evidence that show, this actually works. But then I went on book tour with this book and I talked to hundreds, maybe even thousands of people about, the idea of a basic income. And again and again and again, what happened is that after 20 or 30 minutes or so, I wasn't discussing the empirical evidence anymore, but I was discussing human nature with people, right? Because this was the most common objection people had was, yeah, but what about human nature?
They're going to be so lazy.
Yeah, people are just going to be, I'm not going to be lazy, but those other people are going to be so lazy. Those other people are going to be so selfish and stop working, et cetera, et cetera. And I didn't only encounter this on the right, but also on the left. Actually, maybe even mostly on the left. I was astonished by how much paternalism there was among my peers who look down on the working classes and have this view that the working classes need to be told what to do, right? And that they need this explanation from, us intellectuals and writers, how to live their lives. And that we need to help the poor to spend their money in the right way or something like that. So what I actually realized is that the idea of a basic income, a guaranteed basic income, presupposes a completely different view of human nature. And then I was talking to a good friend of mine. His name is David van Rijbroek. He's, I think, the most important intellectual in Belgium right now. And he had just written a book about participatory democracy, right? How we can do democracy in a radically different way by basically going back to the solution of the ancient Greeks, randomly selecting our politician, drawing by lot instead of having all these career politicians. And again, he had done a huge amount of, just studying the empirical work, all these experiments that have been done with these kind of democratic procedures and basically showing it works. You can bring very diverse people together, left-wing, right-wing, rich, poor, highly educated, no education at all. You can bring them together around a round table, let them have a discussion, and you'll be astonished at the nuance of the discussion and that, they can arrive at very complex solutions that our standard career politicians would never dream of, right? So this really, really works. But he also discovered that the same thing that I did, is that after 20 or 30 minutes, he would always be discussing human nature with other people. So that's basically when my journey started 5 years ago, when I realized that all these hopeful ideas that were going around, that could maybe help us exit the neoliberal era, that all these ideas presupposed a different, more hopeful view of human nature. But I guess that I also realized that, that meant that someone had to write a rather big book, about, about our history and psychology. And so I started doing that.
Yeah.
After a while, I also realized that this book was simply in the air, right? So I'm a hugely privileged guy who, has the time and the means to research a lot of stuff. I'm not affiliated with any university. You know, I don't have this publish or perish disease or whatever. I can just do whatever I want. I write for a journalism platform, The Correspondent, that basically gave me a basic income and says, you know, write one essay a month and we're happy.
That's a good lifestyle.
Yeah. If I wouldn't have written this book, I'm pretty sure someone else would have, because it's simply in the air right now. It's simply a synthesis that's in the air. You know, it's just I'm only connecting the dots of all these different disciplines and experts and people who are already organizing their institutions in a different way. And the only thing I'm saying is, look, something bigger is going on here.
But again, how did it change yourself, maybe in your personal life? So maybe you see the world in some parts differently after the research you did, and maybe you act differently now.
Well, a little bit, obviously. I couldn't resist, you know, writing one chapter, the last chapter of my book, which is sort of the self-helpy chapter, right? Where I draw a couple of rules to live by.
Give us some advice.
Yeah. It's sort of what would Jordan Peterson say if he actually
live like a crap.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit of a joke in his direction. Now, obviously, I should say I'm not a big believer in the self-help genre, and we have too much introspection and not enough outrospection, right? The real challenge is to build different institutions. But I couldn't help drawing a couple of life lessons. So one of the first and maybe most important is that when in doubt, we should assume the best. You know, we often have doubts about other people's intentions. And then we don't know what other people are thinking. For example, we're often very afraid that we'll be conned, right? Especially by strangers, that they will rip us off. But then I read a book by a psychologist called Maria Konnikova, who had just done 4 years of research into, you know, the methods of professional con artists. And she was asked in an interview, you know, Maria, I mean, how has this impacted you? I mean, you must be very wary of strangers right now, right? You know what they can do and how they can rip you off. But she answered, well, actually, the opposite. I've realized that I should see it as collateral damage, that just a couple of times in my life, I'll be ripped off. And that is the price that I should be willing to pay for living a whole life where I can basically trust people around me, which is a fantastic thing, right? Because otherwise the price would be way too high. If I would never want to be conned, never want to be ripped off, I would have to distrust everyone around me. And that's a price that I'm not willing to pay. So I suddenly realized that actually, if you are being conned, you shouldn't feel ashamed, but you may actually feel a little bit proud, right? And if you've never been conned, then maybe you should ask yourself, is my basic attitude to life trusting enough?
Last question, Rutger. When you look into the future, like maybe 10 or 20 years from now, what do you think will happen when more and more people start to change their perceptions of humans as being decent? And this becomes the self-fulfilling prophecy that you wish for it to become?
I don't know. I think I only scratched the surface. The thing is, you know, everything starts with a view of human nature. Political ideology starts with a view of human nature, right? The only political ideology of the modern ideologies that had the same view of human nature as I have was anarchism, right? The anarchists believed basically the same thing as well, which is most people are pretty decent and power corrupts. I mean, that is sort of the short summary of my whole book. The only problem with the anarchists was that they were not very good at building institutions. I mean, remember the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? It was, the analysis was right, but then the method, it didn't really give us lasting institutional change. This is so often a problem among the left and progressive, is that they don't understand institutions. The right understands this much better. They understand power much better than we do. So an initial idea was to write another book called The Anarchist State. So what would the state look like if it would think like an anarchist, right? If we would have centralist tax collection, you know, that would really reduce inequality. But then, for example, if we organized something like healthcare, you know, just have bottom-up healthcare organizations that work in self-directed teams, et cetera, et cetera. Can we combine these two things? I think we can. Universal basic income is another example, right? There are a lot of people on the left who say, oh, it's a neoliberal Trojan horse. And sure, I mean, there are right-wing versions of basic income. But in our utopian version, the best version, you would have a system that would radically reduce inequality, give everyone, the means to make their own choices in their life, right? Have real venture capital for the people so that we can actually see who the real wealth creators are, right? Because if the garbage collectors go on strike, it's a disaster. If the bank workers go on strike, well, no one really cares. So I think that with basic income, you also see this combination that you could call the anarchist state, right? It's quite libertarian when it comes to, giving people the freedom to make their own choices, but it's socialist when it comes to giving people actually the means to make those choices. That is the political direction that I'm interested in. And I have no idea where it's going to lead, but I think it's going to be a better place.
Yeah, it's for us to make these anarchist institutions, which is, we have to redefine power, I guess, when we don't want to copy the right or the old socialist traditions who did it wrong.
Yeah.
Rutger, thank you so much for the interview.
Thank you.
Das war der Dissens-Podcast für diese Woche. Schön, dass ihr dabei wart. Zu Gast war der Historiker und Philosoph Rutger Bregman. Wenn du noch mehr kluge Leute hören willst, dann werde doch jetzt Fördermitglied und unterstütze Dissens. Als Fördermitglied hast du auch diese Woche wieder die Chance auf einen coolen Gewinn, und zwar das Buch von Rutger Bregman, Im Grunde gut. Alle Infos zum Buch und dazu, wie ihr bei Dissens mitmachen könnt, gibt's in den Shownotes und auf dissenspodcast.de. Wenn ihr mehr von Dissens wollt, dann abonniert diesen Podcast auf iTunes, Spotify oder der Podcast-App eurer Wahl. Ich freue mich natürlich auch über Kommentare und Anregungen. Danke fürs Zuhören und bis nächste Woche.